Are you ready to start knitting but do not know what tools to grab? In today's episode, I will be sharing my go-to knitting tools for beginners that won't break the bank, but will make all the difference in your knitting journey. From needles to budget-friendly but gorgeous yarn, I have got you covered. And I'll also reference 2 previous episodes where I dive even deeper into knitting tools and projects for beginners. Plus, if you're feeling like there's just no time for knitting these days, I have something very special to help you with that too. So let's jump into this episode. Welcome to the Knitting Mamas podcast. Are you a mom who feels like you're constantly running on empty? Do you crave a creative outlet to recharge but feel lost on where to start or even when to fit in the time for it? And does the idea of adding one more thing to your busy day feel impossible, especially when it's something just for you? In this podcast, you'll discover practical and guilt-free self-care strategies that fit seamlessly into your life. I'll help you break free from the constant comparison and overwhelm that social media often brings, empowering you to pick up your knitting needles instead of your phone and embrace moments of rest, creativity, and mindfulness. My mission is to help you get more rest and feel less stressed through mindful knitting, simple mindset shifts, and creating a morning routine that actually works for you without the guilt. It's time to ditch the endless scroll on social media and focus on what truly matters, your well-being. Hi, I'm Nadine, a mom, wife, and passionate knitter. I have learned the hard way that chasing perfection and comparing myself to others online only leads to burnout. I spent years trying to do it all, only to realize that taking care of myself was in fact the key to showing up as my best self for my family. I finally let go of the pressure to be perfect, embraced progress over perfection, and created simple routines that actually work. Along the way, I found peace and joy in the cozy, calming rhythm of knitting. Now I'm excited to share these practical tips and habits with you so that you can reclaim your time, recharge, and rediscover the things that bring you happiness. So, if you're ready to take control of your stress, ditch social media comparison, rekindle your creativity, and recharge with a hobby you love, this podcast will guide you every step of the way. Take a deep breath, grab your knitting needles, and let's start creating a life with less stress and more joy, one stitch at a time. So before we dive into the tools, the knitting tools, I have something super fun and special to announce. For a very limited time, I am offering personal coaching sessions to you. I only have 5 spots available of these each month. So this is your chance to actually get personalized support with me. It can be for anything that you're currently struggling with, from finding the time for your creative outlet, if it's knitting or even something else, to reducing stress overall, or creating a flexible routine that works for you. If you want to book an either 15 or 30-minute session with me, or simply see if this is even something that you're looking for or a good fit, you can email me at nadine@thenittingmamas.com. Again, that is nadine@thenittingmamas.com. I am going to put this in the show notes as well in case you have no chance to actually write this down right now. All right. So do you want to learn how to knit, but you are not even sure where to begin when it comes to the right tools? Trust me, you're not alone. I know that the overwhelm is real and there is so much information out there on all the things. And if you go into a yarn store, you probably would get some help, but to be honest, I don't have one close by. And if I go to a Joann's or a Michael's, oftentimes the people in there, unfortunately, don't really know the specifics about what I'm asking. So let me help you out. I'm breaking down my absolute favorite knitting tools for beginners today. And these are all things that will set you up for success without overwhelming you or your budget. I remember when I first got back into knitting back in 2020, I remember how confusing it was to figure out which tools were actually essential and which ones were just nice to have. It had been such a long time. So essentially, besides the actual craft itself, which I did remember more or less how to do, I was a newbie. I was a complete newbie, and I was looking around and everything had changed and there were so many awesome new things. So I do remember thinking, which one is essential and which is oh, that's nice. But I did also not want to spend a ton of money on everything because I wasn't sure if I'm going to end up actually using it. I was like, oh, I want to try knitting again because I remember loving it, but I wasn't 100% sure if I was going to stick with it. And if you're in that place because, you just kind of feel like, oh, this looks so pretty, I wish I could do that, but you're just kind of iffy about spending a lot of money on it just in case it's not for you, I totally get it. So I'm here to make this super easy for you. And here are your must-have tools to get started. All the links to these things, to my favorite versions of them, will be in the show notes for easy reference. First thing up is obviously your knitting needles. Without those, you can't do anything, even if you had yarn. So circular needles are my absolute must-have. I love using circular needles because they're easier to store than long, straight needles. And they are also super comfortable on your hands and wrists because they distribute the weight of the stitches and the yarn much better than straight needles do. For beginners, I recommend starting with a size 8, which is a 5mm needle, and a medium length cord. You'll be able to use these for a lot of projects, but here's another way of determining what size you'd want to get. You can just pick a beginner-friendly simple pattern. As a matter of fact, you can go ahead and line up episode 16 right after this one for some ideas on beginner patterns, and make sure that you get the needle size that the pattern recommends. Next up, you want to get your yarn, of course. So yarn for beginners. It can be pricey, but it doesn't have to be. I always recommend starting with affordable, beginner-friendly options, and some of my favorites here are Lionbrand. For example, Hue and Me, it's spelled H-U-E and Me, or Color Theory. They're both super soft, come in great colors, and are easy to work with without worrying about splurging on any luxury yarn right away, because what if you never end up using it? Even now, I'm still kind of let me keep that for very, very special projects. And my experience that even if I do splurge, it takes me months and months to actually end up using it because I'm just so worried that I'll mess it up or I have to open it again and then it just damages the yarn, all that stuff. So even I stick to these very often. I love the color combos. They're endless. And what's great about these two options is you'll have a bulky and an all year yarn option. So even for summer knits, you can perfectly use the Color Theory. As a matter of fact, I am currently knitting a project in that yarn and I just love how soft it is. Another bonus of these is, especially the Color Theory, the Hue and Me is a wool blend. So there's a little bit of wool in there, but the Color Theory is no wool at all. So if you're like me with a slight wool allergy, this is a perfect option. But I also handle the Hue and Me well. So it depends on this, the kind of severeness of your allergy, I guess. But I definitely use both of these yarns regularly. I am obviously going to link both of these up in the show notes as well. Next up, we have stitch markers. I would not underestimate these little guys. Stitch markers help you keep track of increases. If you are trying those out, this may not be something that you need in the beginning or, need to use them for in the beginning, but there's plenty of other uses for these guys. They can help you count your rows, and you can also use them to help you count your stitches when you cast on your project. And I just did an episode on that little trick. It's episode 39 if you want to check it out as well. It's a super handy trick. I would definitely get a couple of stitch markers. They're inexpensive and can come in handy really quickly during your knitting journey. Number 4, measuring tape. It's a must-have. You'll want a flexible measuring tape so that you can measure your gauge and also track the length of your projects as you knit, because some patterns will say knit this amount of rows so that you know exactly when you count your rows, you are at the length that's required. But other projects, especially when it's a very simple project that has repetitive rows for a long time, it'll say knit this same row or the same pattern or in this pattern until your work measures a certain length. And that's a great time to have a measuring tape handy in your little project bag, which, by the way, is another thing that I recommend grabbing, but I didn't particularly put it on this list because you can really use any bag that you have at home. A measuring tape, or actually I mentioned the measuring tape is also helpful to measure your gauge. Your gauge is very important to check, especially when following a pattern, which you will do as a beginner for sure, so that you end up with the right fit and size. And it's crucial that you start doing that right away and never skip that step. I talk about this plenty of times, so you can hear me talk about this in other episodes as well. Number 5, last tool that I highly recommend to grab as a beginner that is also not breaking the bank is a tapestry needle. You'll need one of these to weave in the ends and finish off your project, also to oftentimes seam your project, because as a beginner, specifically in those beginner projects, which is not a bad thing, but oftentimes you knit the project in multiple pieces so that you do not have to use advanced techniques like increasing, decreasing short rows, picking up stitches, and so on. None of those are hard, but in the beginning it can be overwhelming. So what you do is you generally knit a sweater, for example, in 4 pieces or 5 pieces, and then in the end you stitch them together, seam them together, which is much easier than knitting it in one piece. So you will need this needle for this, but also to weave in your ends. So it's an essential tool to make sure your knitting looks neat and polished at the end. I have 2 episodes to reference. I think I already mentioned one. If you're looking for more detailed information, you can check out episode 5, where I give an extensive list of every tool I recommend for a successful knitting journey. This goes beyond just what you need if you're first starting out. And if you are getting started, episode 16 is also perfect for you. I just mentioned that. I share some simple knitting projects that you can jump into right away after you mastered your basic stitches. And I'm so excited for you. So go ahead and make sure you actually listen to both of those episodes as well. They're going to be linked up in the show notes. Another thing to consider would be my beginner knitters playlist on YouTube, where you can get familiar with the basic stitches in case you are not yet, as well as casting on and casting off and so much more. You can get access to that playlist at thenittingmamas.com/knittingbeginners. Again, it's thenittingmamas.com/knittingbeginners. That's it for today. This was a very short episode. I hope you made some notes. If not, go ahead and just grab a notebook, rewind real quick, listen to it again on 1.5x. But I thank you so much for joining me today for another episode of the Knitting Mamas podcast. I hope this roundup of my favorite beginner tools helps you feel more confident as you start your knitting journey. If you ever have any questions, please hop over into our Knitting Mamas community on Facebook, linked up in the show notes, so that you can ask your questions and we can help you out. And remember, it does not take any fancy tools or a huge investment to get started. And the payoff of this super fun hobby will definitely be priceless. And all it takes is to get started, and you totally got this. Remember, if you need any help getting started with either knitting or making more time for your creative hobby, don't forget to send me that email at nadine@thenittingmamas.com to ask about one of my limited time coaching sessions. I would love to help you create more time and space for the things you love. Until next time, happy knitting, mamas. Thanks so much for hanging out with me on today's episode. I hope you're walking away with a bit more inspiration and a few ideas to make your self-care a priority. If today's chat gave you a little boost, I'd love it if you could leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It helps other moms find our cozy corner of the podcast world and start their own guilt-free self-care journey. Thanks again, and remember, you deserve time for yourself to recharge and feel your best. Catch you next time on the Knitting Mamas podcast.